Right, I think we can get started now. So a very warm welcome to you, wherever you may be, to this new episode of the Franco-German Observatory of the Indo-Pacific. This is a series of webinars, of conferences, and other activities brought to you by the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, the GIGA in Hamburg, and the Center for International Research, the CERI at Sciences Po in Paris. I believe this is actually sort of the 13th webinar we are running, the 5th this year. The main idea of the webinar series is to bring you perspectives, especially of countries in that region or strategic space, if you will. So earlier webinars in the series dealt with perspectives from initially the Quad countries. We had webinars presenting perspectives from China, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Pacific Island countries, Taiwan, the European Union itself. And this year, we are actually sort of trying to sort of alternate between country perspectives and sort of shedding some light on transversal issues. So one of the earlier webinars we had this year was on military build-up in various parts of the Indo-Pacific, and future webinars will deal with issues like multilateralism in the Indo-Pacific, connectivity issues, and so on. So today's webinar is actually hosted by the GIGA. We are alternating with the CERI in that regard. We always have a French and a German co-moderator. So my co-moderator today will be David Camus, who's joining us from Paris. And I'm truly excited about sort of today's webinar, which will be on New Zealand's perspectives on the Indo-Pacific, the kind of sort of dilemmas the country may face. We have a wonderful speaker today. David Capie is joining us from Victoria University in Wellington, where he's also heading the Center for Strategic Studies. That's New Zealand's premier foreign policy and security issues think tank. I can think of no better speaker than David to enlighten us about New Zealand's perspectives. David has been sort of working on Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific issues on Southeast Asian affairs. He's a professor of international relations at Victoria University in Wellington, and is also busy as a think tanker, as a commentator on international affairs, on public affairs. So I'm really truly excited about this event. It's sort of entitled New Zealand's sort of Indo-Pacific dilemmas. So I wonder whether this is all about sort of, or actually about sort of how New Zealand stopped worrying and started loving the Indo-Pacific concept, or maybe it's a bit more complicated than that. We'll find out in a minute or two. So before I hand the mic to David Capie in Wellington, David Camus, you want to also come in and say hello to our audience?
Yes, good morning to everybody, or good evening in the case of New Zealand. We have an agreement with David. We're not going to mention the word rugby or All Blacks, Wallabies, or so. So we'll try and do this in the Anzac spirit, so to speak, across the pond, as they say back in the Antipodes. I find it's very important that we have David speaking to us about New Zealand. I think one of the many values in our observatory is to hear the voices that are not often heard. Not just to look at the Indo-Pacific from a great power perspective, whether it be from Europe or the United States or China, but to see how other players who are important in ways that we need to measure. Anyway, I shall stop there and let David Capie this time give his presentation to us.
Well, look, thanks so much, David and Patrick, for a very warm welcome. Thanks to the Franco-German Observatory, to GIGA, to SERI, and the organisers for the chance to be part of this webinar series. Let me just start by saying it's really nice to see my old friends David Kamru and Patrick Köllner again, and thanks very much to those of you who are tuning in and watching. I'm guessing that for some of you, if my timing is right, that is probably your first week back in the office after the summer holidays. And so I'm hoping that this talk this morning, your time, this evening, New Zealand time, doesn't have you yearning for the beaches any more than you already are. So it's really a pleasure to have the chance to speak with you this evening, New Zealand time. Now, my understanding of this webinar series, which listening to Patrick describe it from the outset, sounds absolutely fascinating. And congratulations to both centres for putting on such a busy and eclectic series of talks over the last few years. I'm a little nervous at being number 13, an unlucky number perhaps, but one of my understanding was that it was interested in collecting some of the views of the Indo-Pacific from a different range of speakers from different countries. And so what I thought I would do today, in providing some sort of introductory remarks, is really do a couple of things. And the first one was really just to give you a sense of how New Zealand has approached this idea, this concept of Indo-Pacific. And how that thinking has evolved since 2018 or so. As Patrick put it, how we learn to love the Indo-Pacific. It's an interesting process in itself, or at least how we came to accept the idea of the Indo-Pacific. And then secondly, really, I think to go beyond the actual concept itself, and talk about some of the dilemmas that exist for New Zealand as a small, open, democratic trading nation that's trying to find its way in a much more sharply contested and divided region, and some of the security challenges that we're all probably familiar with and what they look like from a New Zealand perspective. And then if there are things that I don't cover that touch on things you're interested in, I'm happy to cover those in the Q&A. So I guess to the first part, the idea of the concept of Indo-Pacific itself, I think it would be fair to say that New Zealand was a little bit of a latecomer to the Indo-Pacific Party. And it's interesting to think about this in some ways when you think that this was a conception of region, an animating framework that was used by New Zealand's only formal ally, Australia, going back to 2013, at least possibly earlier. That it was manifest in important Australian foreign policy and defence documents, that it was picked up around 2016 or 2017 by key partners such as the United States and countries that New Zealand had proclaimed a desire to build a deeper relationship with, such as Japan and India. And so you might have thought that it would be a framework that would have had some sort of intuitive appeal, or even a kind of infectious diffusion, that it might have slipped across the borders, slipped across the pond, across the Tasman, and been picked up in the New Zealand lexicon. But it really didn't happen until about 2018 or so, in the first term of the Jacinda Ardern government, when Ardern's government was in coalition with New Zealand First. And then we started to see it sort of creep sporadically into speeches. And it was very sporadic. It was sort of occasional mentions, and it really, I don't think, had been completely thought through as a concept. I remember being at the Shangri-La Dialogue with then Defence Minister Ron Mark in June 2018. And in his remarks, he had referred consistently to New Zealand's interests in the Asia-Pacific, and the Asia-Pacific that, and the Asia-Pacific this. And one of the questioners put up a hand and said, Mr. Mark, that's a very interesting speech you've given there, but I wonder why is it that New Zealand continues to use Asia-Pacific when all of your partners and so many other people here at the conference have used the Indo-Pacific? And he sort of looked at the question and said, that's a very good question. I think we might need to go back and revisit our terminology. But I think probably by the end of 2018, a New Zealand position was beginning to emerge, and you started to hear officials talk about New Zealand's having interests in the Indo-Pacific, that we understood that it was an important idea to others. And you started to see it being summed up or reflected in a set of principles. And I think these principles probably won't surprise anybody, or certainly won't surprise anybody who's looked at New Zealand foreign policy for a number of years. And their principles, for example, around open and inclusive arrangements, the importance of transparency, of principles like freedom of navigation and freedom of overflight, the importance of international law, especially UNCLOS, open markets, very important for a professed free trader, and of course also that vital genuflection to the importance of ASEAN centrality. But New Zealand, I think when it picked it up, tried to use it, there was a little bit of conceptual gymnastics at first, where officials started to say, well, in forums where India is present, like the East Asia Summit, we'll talk about the Indo-Pacific. When we're in APEC, we'll talk about the Asia-Pacific. And when we're in the South Pacific, we'll just call it the Pacific. And I guess that was I think that was an attempt for a while. But I suppose there's a bigger question that it begs here, and that is why the hesitancy? Why was New Zealand reluctant to take up this terminology? And I think, for one thing, if you contrast the Australian and New Zealand contexts, one obvious difference is that Australia has an Indian Ocean coastline and a strong Indian Ocean connection. It just doesn't exist in New Zealand. And while New Zealand has interests in the Indian Ocean, it's a long way away, and it just doesn't really resonate in the same way as it does for our most important partner. I think also there were real questions about what the Indo-Pacific concept might mean for existing cooperative arrangements. And New Zealand was, I think, more comfortable with the idea of the Asia-Pacific order and an ASEAN-centered regional architecture than almost anyone else, including, I would say, a number of the ASEANs themselves. And I think there was a question about just what would an Indo-Pacific framework mean for processes that had served New Zealand pretty well to that point in time. And I'll come back to this, I think. And related to this, of course, New Zealand was also hosting APEC in 2021. It was a big deal. It was the first time in 22 years that New Zealand had hosted this huge international conference. And of course, it would have been nothing but a little bit awkward, at least, to suddenly change from Asia Pacific to Indo Pacific in the year that you were hosting APEC. Of course, in the end, APEC happened to go. My dog has just come into the room and opened the door. Is being tried to be lured out by my wife. There were questions, I think, about where the South Pacific fit into all of this. And then, to be honest, I think that we also have to accept that there was a factor here in which Indo-Pacific was seen as a term that was used by some states that were taking a sharper position towards China. In some cases, using Indo-Pacific as a label that they were attaching to a military strategy of a much more confrontational approach. And that was something that New Zealand clearly wasn't comfortable with in that sense. But I think if there was some hesitancy, that came to an end last July on Bastille Day, as it turns out, in Wellington, where Prime Minister Ardern gave a speech to the Institute of International Affairs, where she talked about the Indo-Pacific as New Zealand's wider home. And she restated those key principles that I mentioned earlier as the sort of the basis of New Zealand's understanding of the Indo-Pacific. And I think that really marked an important sort of inflection in the sense of she was putting her stamp of endorsement on the term, the government stamp of endorsement. But that said, there was also a really telling phrase in the speech, which jumped out at me, and I think said a lot about how New Zealand wants to see the region and the concept. And the Prime Minister Ardern said, you know, of these principles, the principles of openness and inclusivity are especially key for New Zealand. Often language and geographic frames are used as subtext or a tool to exclude some nations from dialogue. Our success will depend on working with the widest possible set of partners, unquote. So in other words, New Zealand was kind of taking a different approach to some of the more confrontational positions with the concept, not trying to draw a line down the Pacific, certainly not signing up to an idea of a conflict of systems between autocracies and democracies. And this is a line that I think the Prime Minister and other ministers, have restated, not least most recently in the Prime Minister's speech at the Lowy Institute in Sydney just a number of weeks ago. So for those people out there who are sort of Indo-Pacific concept train spotters, I think you can argue that New Zealand's approach to Indo-Pacific has probably a fair bit in common with the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, and also in some ways with the EU's concept with its emphasis on cooperation. So look, that's a bit of a discussion of the evolution of the concept in the New Zealand context. Now it is used routinely, it is used commonly, but maybe I can move to the second part of the talk, which is really what are some of the real dilemmas that the Indo-Pacific is throwing up for New Zealand right now. And I guess I would start by saying as context that I think it's pretty well widely regarded in Wellington that New Zealand's strategic environment is the most challenging it has been in many decades. There's a growing sense of vulnerability and the sense that the strategic environment has taken a fairly dramatic turn for the worse. And if you look at the defense assessment that was released at the end of 2021, it talked about two big challenges, one of which was, interestingly enough, it talked about big challenges to New Zealand's defense interests, a term that we hadn't really heard much of before, and said that really the big challenge, one of the two big challenges was strategic competition, which really it said was a function of a much more powerful China that was increasingly assertive in this region. And if you look at New Zealanders' public perceptions of China, as they have in many democratic states over the last few years, there's been a sharp shift in public perceptions. And the Asia-New Zealand Foundation, which has undertaken a longitudinal public opinion poll on New Zealanders' positions towards Asia, found a pretty significant jump in the percentage of people who perceive China as a threat. From 2021 to this year, jumping from 37% to 58%. The percentage of people who had low trust in China had jumped to 73%. And I think there are a number of reasons for that shift, which will be familiar to people watching, including the shift in Hong Kong, which I think was keenly felt in New Zealand, as lots of New Zealanders had connections and family and ties to Hong Kong. Developments in Xinjiang, economic coercion against Australia, which obviously got a lot of coverage here, and also more recently, a greater sense of the PRC's interests in the South Pacific. And I guess on top of that, if you think about a much more confrontational region generally in which the space for small states is getting smaller, concerns about a polarized United States, a general weakening of a multilateral system, and these have all been exacerbated recently by the war in Ukraine, which, as well as, I think, an affront to the rules-based order in New Zealand, like many places, has had real flow-on costs in terms of prices, supply chain disruption, the cost of living. So that's the context. It really does feel like there's a much gloomier view of the strategic environment here than I can remember in many, many decades. So what are the dilemmas that I talk about? And I'll touch on maybe on these fairly briefly, just so that we have plenty of time for questions. And again, here I think the first one that I would point to is the challenge, and it's certainly not a unique New Zealand challenge, but is the challenge of trying to find a way to sustain a relationship with China while managing a growing sense of the risks that the PRC presents, and trying to avoid damage to a vital economic relationship. New Zealand's trade with China has fairly significantly increased during COVID. China now takes 33% of New Zealand exports, so it's a vital economic relationship. At the same time, there's been a significant shift in New Zealand's China settings since 2018. And we can point to those in areas like export controls, investment screening, cyber attribution, shifts around 5G. But by and large, these have been done fairly quietly and framed, generally speaking, in a country agnostic way. So to take the shift on 5G, for example, rather than saying New Zealand is going to ban Huawei technology in its 5G network, the way the process was set up was that a bid went forward from a telecom provider to the regulatory authorities that reviewed it, they concluded that there were issues for national security, but at no point did they ever say this particular company can't work in the system, or companies from China can't work in the system. But the end result in some ways was the same. And those challenges, whether it's cyber, whether it's export controls, whether it's issues around extradition, around foreign interference, those issues just continue to come up all the time. They're constantly popping up and requiring some kind of New Zealand response. And I think what we've seen is that New Zealand is articulating concerns where it sees them, but it wants to do so in a way that underscores that it has an independent voice, and wants to do so in a way that reflects a kind of a tone, a diplomatic style that it's comfortable with. And so, for example, if we saw Prime Minister Ardern at the NATO summit, she expressed a view that the government had made before about concerns about a more assertive China, but she was also very keen to stress that New Zealand didn't go to Madrid looking for new alliances. So sometimes the emphasis, the way that those positions are expressed is slightly different. So that's an ongoing challenge. A second challenge I would point to is this question of, where's the focus of priorities? Is it the Indo-Pacific or the South Pacific? And the Ardern government since 2017 has made much of New Zealand's identity as a Pacific country, frequently talks about being in and of the South Pacific. And the Pacific has been a priority for the government. Was in its first term, where Foreign Minister Winston Peters launched his Pacific Reset, and there was a big injection of aid money and diplomatic posts into the region, although in some ways that then was impeded, of course, by COVID, which shut down a lot of those connections. The new foreign minister, or in the second term, Nanaia Mahuta, has used her own concept of Pacific resilience to emphasize the importance of the Pacific and to stress her particular approach to foreign policy that's grounded in some of those indigenous connections. But so there's no doubt this has been a lot of focus on the Pacific. But in terms of priorities, I think there is a little bit of a dilemma, or at least a debate in New Zealand about quite where this focus should be. The 2018 Strategic and Defence Policy Statement raised the Pacific to the same level of priority for the Defence Forces defending New Zealand territory. The Defence Assessment last year gave a huge amount of attention to the South Pacific, and the Defence Minister, Pine Henry, announced that his 3 priorities for defence, and they're all very close to home, were people, infrastructure, and the Pacific. And I guess so one argument that comes out of this focus is if you don't choose priorities, if you don't prioritize with limited resources, then you don't have a strategy. Limited funds means New Zealand's priority has to be the South Pacific. We have to be able to do things there. We can operate elsewhere, but that's more of a discretionary choice. Now, against that, I think there's a contrary view, and this is, I think, a live debate, that the challenge is that we're seeing in the South Pacific really result from instability in the wider region, in wider East Asia, and that New Zealand needs capabilities, relationships, and investments that allow us to have influence in this wider region. And I think this debate is playing out. I think it's an important one because it also affects some big capability decisions for the Defence Force that the government has begun a process to think about in a defence policy review. A third set of dilemmas is one that goes back to something that Patrick touched on in his remarks at the beginning as a topic that you have coming up in another webinar, and that's about the rise of minilateralism. New Zealand was an Asia-Pacific enthusiast. We're a true believer, I think, in the regional architecture and in the importance of inclusive multilateralism. I sometimes was struck by that. I sometimes felt that New Zealand was a bigger believer in the ASEAN-centered architecture than many of the ASEANs themselves. And I think that was an architecture, a process that gave New Zealand a seat at the table, a voice, an opportunity to be heard, an opportunity to mix with other leaders that it wouldn't necessarily have had otherwise. The problem, of course, is that this is an architecture and a structure of cooperation that's under huge strain. Internally through divisions over issues like Myanmar, but also because it's feeling those pressures, those push and pull factors of strategic competition. And in some ways, that's not entirely new, but what is new is, I think, the rise of alternatives. And what we're seeing is an increasing number of states in the region continue to invoke ASEAN centrality, but yet they don't really believe in it anymore. And I think when you see the attention that arrangements like Quad, like AUKUS, the growing number of trilaterals are getting, these are processes that are on the move. And probably while they were focused on hard security issues, and that probably presented, fewer dilemmas for the existing architecture and for countries like New Zealand that were comfortable with it. But as these groups get a broader mandate, so for example, as the Quad goes from being focused on confronting China or thinking about addressing the China challenge, and instead starts to go on to talk about climate change or vaccines or connectivity or critical infrastructure, and the same goes for AUKUS. When it goes beyond nuclear submarines and starts talking about cyber or AI or underwater technologies, the broader that mandate gets, the higher the cost there is for countries like New Zealand not to at least connect with those arrangements. If standards are being set, New Zealand wants to have a voice in those processes. But right now, we're not in those processes. There are murmurings about possible connections, but not very much. So that's, I think, another dilemma that's in some ways still yet to be confronted. And then finally, just a fourth dilemma that occurred to me earlier today when I was thinking about this talk. And I think in some ways it's what I would call a discursive dilemma that grows out of the challenges in the region. And that is that I think that this is a government that has adjusted internally to a world and a region of growing threats and understands those. But I don't think it's quite worked out how to talk to New Zealanders about those challenges. So, for example, in a speech in Chatham House in London a few months ago, and again in Lowy, more recently, the Prime Minister would refer to just how, it's grim out there. This is a really, it's a difficult world. But there's only been a limited sense, I think, of how New Zealand actually needs to adjust in response. We've seen a strong response to the war in Ukraine, but a much more careful tone when it's come to addressing challenges in the Indo-Pacific. And part, I think it would be interesting to speculate about why this is. I think the government has an ambitious domestic agenda. It continues to frame a lot of foreign policy in an economic and trade context, which is obviously important, but there are many other things going on as well. And I think one of the things that struck me reading the Prime Minister's Lowy speech recently was just, the continued emphasis on the need to fix multilateralism, that collectivism and multilateralism was emphasized as one of the core underpinnings of an independent foreign policy. Lots of talk about the importance of dialogue, de-escalation, and diplomacy. And while these are all good things, it seems to me that the government hasn't found a way yet to talk to New Zealanders about a world of power that is reasserting itself, a world of threats, and a much more challenging environment for New Zealand going forward. Unfortunately, I don't think these dilemmas are going away soon, which makes for interesting times for those of us who study it, but challenging times for policymakers and leaders of a small, open, democratic state. Look, I'll leave it there. And Patrick and David, thank you for having me, and I'll look forward to taking your questions.
Right, David, thanks so much. I mean, that was really, really illuminating to the result. And I also very much appreciated that at the very end, you talked about sort of, how the government, how Jacinda Ardern and others are talking, are trying to talk to a domestic audience about these sort of pressing issues, because this is sometimes something we tend to neglect. We talk about sort of strategic issues and stuff like that, but obviously, at the end of the day, this is what really matters most, I would say. Now, I have tons of questions, somewhat general and somewhat specific, that I would like to ask. But of course, sort of our main job is to bring in the audience. Basically, there are two options to raise your questions. Either you could just sort of put up your hand, and then we will call upon you. Or you can put in your questions via the Q&A function here. So we will then collect and ask you sort of, to put forward your questions to David Capie. While we are collecting, maybe we can get started. David, no, David Camru, do you want to get started?
I think that was the very important point that Patrick just said, is how do you talk to a domestic audience about the Indo-Pacific? Our first, one of our first webinars was with Rory Medcalf, talking about the Australian view. And the point he made was the role of politicians from Perth in Western Australia, who face the Indian Ocean, who are able then to articulate a view throughout Australia about Australia being an Indo-Pacific country. And I think this is the point you're making about New Zealand, is New Zealand sees itself more as a South Pacific country. And you don't have that sort of domestic kind of way that this discourse is rooted in the country itself. I think we need to leave room for lots of other people to ask questions. My two questions would concern New Zealand and AUKUS, and New Zealand and the Quad. At one point, there was talk about, a Quad, sort of a B team for the Quad, involving countries like New Zealand, South Korea, and others. Where are we with that? And where are we in New Zealand in relation to AUKUS? And the door being open or closed for New Zealand being part of AUKUS.
Shall I go ahead and answer that?
Yeah, go ahead and answer so we can get some other questions.
Well, look, thanks, David. Really good observation at the beginning about that different set of the domestic politics. You're absolutely right. The Pacific resonates far more in New Zealand. I mean, I think you're right. The Indo-Pacific concept sounded, I think, strange to many New Zealanders at first. But the Pacific, I mean, there's huge connections. There's domestic politics. There's a lot. There's a lot that makes that a much more tangible connection. In terms of Quad and AUKUS, I think those are really, really interesting points. I mean, the first thing I would say is that I think there's a little bit of mythology that's evolved around this so-called Quad Plus process that emerged during COVID. And I think that there were a number of meetings that happened between the US, Japan, Australia, India, and then I think it was Vietnam, South Korea, and New Zealand were part of those processes. And they were largely around, I think, supply chain issues, and there was a bit about vaccine issues. And I think that was a label that sort of got put on a process that really was not really, I don't think, particularly closely connected with the objectives of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. So I think that was a bit of a red herring in some way. Mm-hmm. But I think that the bigger point here is the one that I tried to make, and that is, if you look at the members of AUKUS, they're three very important partners for New Zealand. If you look at the Quad, you're talking about our only ally, a very close security partner, and two other countries that New Zealand wants to grow its relationship with. And I think that as long as those were narrowly focused on, for example, submarine acquisition or a sharper confrontation, hard security confrontation with China, it was easier to say that that was probably not a space that was going to be a fit for New Zealand. But I think as their mandate has grown, I think that there will be growing interest and also growing costs for New Zealand not to connect in some way to those processes. Now, so far, I think, when the Prime Minister was asked if New Zealand had been, was about to sign up for the Quad when she went to Washington, I think she said, no, we haven't been asked, and nor would I expect us to be. But I think what we're but at the same time, there have been sort of hints that if a work program were to develop, for example, in AUKUS, on cyber or artificial intelligence or underwater, capabilities or whatever, that there was that had relevance for New Zealand, that there might be a way to plug into that. And I think it was, I think probably the way that New Zealand's talked about it is that it has this set of principles that are really important to the way that it approaches the Indo-Pacific. And if there are arrangements that help safeguard those principles and advance those principles and are compatible with those principles, then it shouldn't feel difficult to connect to them. I thought, finally, just briefly, I thought it was very interesting. Richard Marles, the Australian Deputy Prime Minister, made some comments the other day while he was flying up to, I think he was flying to the exercise Pitch Black in Northern Australia, and was asked about AUKUS and new members. And he was saying, well, look, if it did expand, it would make a lot of sense for it to be close partners like Canada and New Zealand, but sort of, let's wait and see. But yeah, so I think I suspect some of those connections will grow over time.
David, if I may also come in with a few questions. I mean, obviously, New Zealand is in a rather tricky position, sort of having to perform a very delicate balancing act here. On the one hand, you have the close partnership with the United States and other Five Eyes partners. So there's that on the one side, and on the other hand, and you mentioned that you have this very close and very important economic links to China that actually have grown even during the pandemic. And when we look at what New Zealand exports to China, that's from China's point of view probably more easily substitutable than for example what Australia would export. I mean, we're not talking iron ores here. We're talking agricultural products, a dairy industry, for companies like Fonterra. Chinese market is hugely important, so it matters very much for New Zealand's prosperity. So how would you characterize the overall policy that New Zealand governments have been pursuing in recent years, and what they might be pursuing in the future? So is it some kind of asymmetrical hedging that governments are engaged in, or do you actually see taking a more long-term perspective, even turn towards non-alignment, also given, of course, New Zealand takes very much pride in its principled, independent policy, and when you look at actually, can I say the first Cold War, non-alignment was a policy that a number of smaller powers did take at some point. So how would you characterize the overall policy? So that's just a general picture. And then I have a very specific question. You mentioned Jacinda Ardern's fascinating speech in Wellington, where she outlined New Zealand's take on the Indo-Pacific, being very inclusive, and I agree, quite close to the ASEAN outlook in the Indo-Pacific, also the EU's strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. Sometimes I felt it was in places a bit ambiguous, and I wonder whether it was on purpose and ambiguous, and what was actually implied by that. You mentioned working with, I think, was widest range of possible partners. So what do we read in that? Did that mean China? Did it mean Taiwan? Did it mean all of these? So was it on purpose? that sort of no countries were mentioned. And there were, every now and then you also find in speeches sort of warnings against the militarization of the Pacific. So is that direct at China, or is it also a subtle dig at Australia? Or am I reading too much into this?
Well, thanks, Patrick. Those are big, huge, sprawling, hard questions. So thanks very much. I mean, let me start with the first one. You know, I think this, you know, a lot of the discussion about how New Zealand finds its strategic challenges, a lot of the commentary, I think, frames this in the language of a balancing act, as if it is two equidistant weights on either side of New Zealand, and it's trying to walk a line, and that any slight commentary in one way is a lean towards China, any slight commentary or gesture is a lean towards Washington. New Zealand doesn't issue a statement on with Five Eyes on such and such, it's suddenly in China's camp. New Zealand issues a joint statement in Washington, and suddenly it's in Washington's pocket. I mean, you know, I find that particular framework really frustrating, because, you know, I think that this is, you know, New Zealand is not non-aligned. The independent foreign policy is not the same as non-alignment. It is not the same as neutrality. New Zealand has a formal alliance with Australia, but it also has a very close alignment with the United States on security. And the movement in that relationship since 2012, when the Washington Declaration was signed, has been, you know, quite dramatic. And I think sometimes here you also, it's not a bad thing. Sometimes the rhetoric can be quite measured and quite careful, and that gives you one sign, one clue of a country's position. I think the other thing sometimes is to look at what a country does. And if you look at New Zealand's frigates, first frigate came back from its refit in Canada at the end of last year, as well as the new tanker Aotearoa. And one of their first missions that they carried out in the Indo-Pacific was to go up to Southeast Asia, where they joined the British carrier Queen Elizabeth, and at one point then joined with two US carriers, a Japanese carrier, and sailed through the South China Sea. Now, I mean, that says something. It might not have been followed by loud flag waving, loud speechifying and pronouncements, but I think that's an indication of pretty clear alignment. So, but at the same time, New Zealand has like many countries in the region, has a vital economic relationship with China, and it wants to manage the risks that it sees from China's rise and a more assertive China, while also recognizing that that's a very important political relationship and a vital economic relationship. And I think it's really challenging, and it's a little bit reactive rather than long-term strategizing. I don't think some of these ideas like asymmetric hedging really quite capture the spontaneous nature of the kind of responses and calibration. So I hope that kind of answers your difficult question. The second one on the Prime Minister's speech in July last year on the Indo-Pacific. Yeah, look, I think it would be fair to say there is an element of ambiguity that's threading through New Zealand foreign policy on some of these big questions. It's part of this challenging act, if you like, this challenging process that requires to try and manage a series of interests at the same time, to manage that economic relationship, that political relationship with the PRC, while also addressing the interests of New Zealand's own interests and those of our partners. And so I thought that comment about an open and inclusive region and not seeing Indo-Pacific as a subtext or a framework for excluding some, to me that was a way of saying this is a New Zealand understanding of Indo-Pacific. It's based on these principles that we understand. And just because we're using this concept, and so are others to use it in the context of a military strategy, this is not the same thing as that approach. And so there's some ambiguity, there's some differentiation there, I think, that's deliberate and that's important to New Zealand.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much indeed.
We have a question from Jean Duret, a student at Sciences Po, grad student at Sciences Po. Very interesting question. You talked about the importance of New Zealand for trade for New Zealand as a trading nation. And the question she asks is, New Zealand is a member of two important economic frameworks in the region, the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity launched by Joe Biden. What do you think is and will be New Zealand's role in the two frameworks? Also, I should add that New Zealand is a member of the CPTPP as well. So yeah. How can these be, how does New Zealand attempt to try and reconcile membership of these two or three regional bodies?
Thanks very much for the question. I was glad that you mentioned CPTPP, because I think that's one that, for a long time, that was the key foreign policy objective for successive New Zealand governments, was to create an economic framework in the region that would bring in the United States and Japan and others. And of course, in the case of the US, that hasn't turned out to be. I mean, I think in some ways this is a way. These RCEP and CPTPP are ways of constructing or participating in architecture that allows New Zealand to try and maximize its integration in the region, to try and offset the risk of exclusion. I mean, I think that there's a strong drive in New Zealand's engagement with the region on a desire to be inside arrangements. I sometimes have heard New Zealand described as a compulsive joiner, that it's much better to be inside, looking out, and inside maybe wondering where things are going, than on the outside trying to get in. And I think with RCEP, for example, for a long time, there was a little bit of a frustration around the quality of the arrangements that were being discussed there. But I think there's always the argument that over time, those arrangements can evolve. And I think that was one of the reasons why it was a real frustration for New Zealand that India took itself out of RCEP very late in those negotiations. Because of course, if you look at the countries around that region, and this is the irony of the Indo-Pacific for New Zealand, of course, is that we have free trade arrangements with almost all of the countries in the region, apart from across Asia, apart from two, the United States and India. So TPP was a really important objective, and I think it's getting a lot of focus now with the talk of the UK perspective as a prospective member. IPEF, I think, is a different arrangement. It's still, I think, there's a lot of questions about just quite what the content of IPEF is. It's a very different sort of arrangement in that in the past, we know that in exchange for taking on standards and meeting certain standards, usually there's been an exchange of market access rights. And in this case, this is, as the United States says, a different kind of economic arrangement that won't include that market access. I suspect that, like in parts of Southeast Asia, this is being looked on with a little bit of skepticism. But again, that it's still a process that's that's important to engage with. When the largest economy in the world puts forward a new framework for economic cooperation, again, it's one that you want to engage with and see where it goes. So I think there's probably still a question mark over those. And alongside those, I mean, just quickly, I think one of the other things that's interesting is that I say that New Zealand has to wrestle with this challenge of not really coming to grips with security minilateralism. In some ways, what strikes me as ironic is that New Zealand has actually been very creative in minilateral frameworks, in building block frameworks in the economic sphere. And if we think about the origins of CPTPP, for example, that began with the P4, which was New Zealand, Singapore, Brunei, and Chile. If we look at arrangements around digital trade, the deeper arrangement, again, another one New Zealand was instrumental in creating, and another one on climate trade and climate change. So there is that creativity there, and those arrangements, I think, are also ones to watch.
Would you, a follow-on question, would you include the signing of the free trade agreement with Britain, and I think there's a negotiation with the European Union with New Zealand? Where does the European Union fit in to how New Zealand sees the Indo-Pacific? Especially given French territories in the South Pacific.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. So I think there's a couple of different dimensions there. One is that as New Zealand sees a more challenging global economic environment, sees the fracturing of the global economy, sees the growth of protectionism, then the European market has always been important to New Zealand, and it's the desire for an FTA has only increased. And in fact, I don't know if it hasn't finally been whatever the ratification process that has to take place now, I think in the European Parliament. Is that right? But the agreement itself has been concluded. So that was seen as a way to try and begin to diversify some of New Zealand's trade dependencies. The deal that originated was finalized with the EU, I think was probably a disappointment to parts of the agricultural sector in New Zealand that saw disappointing levels of access for important agricultural products. On the other hand, some parts, some producers felt they did quite well. So that was one dimension. It's got a lot of critical debate, I would say, in New Zealand, whether or not it was a good deal or not. I think the second dimension is the EU's role in the Indo-Pacific. And as a strategy, I think the EU strategy on the Indo-Pacific was one that there's a lot of commonality with the sort of approach that New Zealand has taken in a way it thinks about the region. As I mentioned in my remarks, it's a framework for cooperation, more so than framed in that sharper confrontational terms. The idea of EU members playing a role in the regions, in building regional order, in contributing to regional security. We've seen a German German presence and a Dutch presence in the region in the recent past, and of course a very important French presence in the South Pacific as well. So and that working with France has been an important relationship for New Zealand through the so-called Pacific Quad, focused the US, France, Australia, and New Zealand working on the South Pacific. EU's have been a big aid donor to the Pacific as well, and so I think it's there's also a recognition that Europe probably has a few other challenges at the moment that it's focused on, but as in terms of its approach to a rules-based order and those common values, it's an important and welcome partner.
David, so I have also a follow-up question on this one, sort of a tricky one, or sort of even a sensitive one. I'm not quite sure. I mean, when you look at sort of the EU's strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, I mean, you'll find a number of sort of action areas mentioned there. I mean, it's all the way from sort of trade policy, climate policy, sort of to human security and so on. And of course, there's also this maritime security dimension in there, which is received quite a bit of interest, because I mean, also the strategy is seen as linked to the EU's will to play a more sort of geopolitical role on the world stage. And now we've also seen a couple of sort sort of engagements. You mentioned sort of the Bayern, the German frigate, being in the Indo-Pacific for something like 7 months. You mentioned earlier on Pitch Black, sort of the Australian exercise. I think we've had something like 6 Eurofighters and sort of support planes in there and so on. And we have quite a debate here, I guess, in Germany as well, whether that is all useful, whether it plays a constructive role in terms of helping sort of to improve stability or security more broadly in the Indo-Pacific, or whether it's sort of counterproductive. Some people here see it as sort of something like gunboat diplomacy, sort of, and others, of course, say, this is important. It's important also in symbolic terms. You mentioned rule-based international order. So what's your take on this sort of, increased sort of military deployments to the Indo-Pacific? Do the Europeans have a role there to play, or should they really, as you also mentioned, sort of, maybe focus on their neighborhood?
Well, look, I think that there are, do you mean from a New Zealand perspective, or what's my? I mean,
you choose.
Well, I think my view is that there are obviously clearly strong common interests between New Zealand and the European Union around strong elements of international law, around the maritime domain, respect for UNCLOS, and seeing some of those common challenges. So I think to the extent that there are ways to reinforce and support international law and the law of the sea from those sorts of challenges, that those are welcome, and whether or not those are represented by visits from military vessels or political statements and political expressions of support, they're still very important and very welcome. But I think we probably also need to be fairly sober about the extent to which the EU and Europe is going to have an impact on the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that there are a few people who've perhaps got a little a little carried away at the difference that will make. And as I say, I think that the other dilemma is with Ukraine. I think that's just raised a huge number of questions. Although I suppose it can potentially cut two ways, that if you believe that Ukraine is going to have a catalytic effect on European defense expenditure and force a rethink of Europe's own defense role and defense autonomy, that ultimately it might either free up US capacity for a greater presence in the Indo-Pacific, or might ultimately might allow it for it to play a larger role. But I think probably on a number of those security issues, whether it's hard security issues, maritime security issues, transnational crime and others, partly it's also about norm building, and it's about political commitments that are really important.
All right, thank you very much indeed. David, looking at David Cameron here again, do we have sort of last questions from the audience, or questions that you might sort of want to ask, because otherwise we would have to slowly bring this to a close?
Well, the question is really something that there's no other question from the audience, but a point you touched upon, which I think is neglected, is what occurred in Hong Kong and what has happened in the Taiwan Straits. To what extent is that fed into perceptions of China as a threat in New Zealand? Is this, really, I mean, Hong Kong is often, which for me has meant that the idea of one country, two systems, was basically a lie, or was sort of something that we kind of believed in a self-serving kind of way. To what extent is that impacted upon these perceptions of China in New Zealand?
Yeah, I think Hong Kong is a really interesting one, actually. I mean, I think there are, lots of New Zealanders have family connections or have had business ties or have passed through Hong Kong. There are a surprisingly large number of people who felt, I think, really strongly animated about what they saw as the shifts that have taken place in Hong Kong over the last 2 or 3 years, and I think have responded really strongly to that. It also played out domestically here in terms of you had, so for example, protests on campuses where people were, advocating for against national security law and so on, and then counter protests. So it played into some of those issues around foreign interference, or so it became quite sharply political, and became quite an issue. I think the Taiwan Straits issue, I think, most recently, it's become another one of the issues where over the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a sort of consistent drip or drumbeat of just stories that have had a cumulative impact on how New Zealanders see China, and whether or not that's Xinjiang or Hong Kong, political interference, the kind of intemperate language that's come out of the Wolf Warriors, coercion of Australia, South China Sea. The list goes on and on and on. And I think Taiwan is just it's been sort of fed into that milieu, and that probably there'll be a strong number of people who will think that the cause of the latest confrontation, that Nancy Pelosi's visit was ill-judged and provocative, but it doesn't. But they'll also see China's response as heavy-handed and disproportionate and just really troubling. So it's just becoming a familiar pattern that's playing out very regularly at the moment.
Right. Thank you very much indeed. I guess it's my job now sort of to draw this to close. This has been the most fascinating, most informative, most insightful session. Truly, truly grateful to you, David, especially sort of, this late time of the day, spending your time with us. I think this showed once again how important it is to engage with our friends and colleagues in New Zealand with so important perspectives to share on the Indo-Pacific and beyond. So very much looking forward to real face-to-face interactions at some point again. Maybe sort of next year, 2023. I think it's the year of the Rugby World Cup in France, when I guess if the All Blacks will be under their new coach, Scott Robertson, a prime contender for the World Cup. Sorry for the quip. But no, thank you so much.
No, you're not. Hey, look, thank you so much. Thanks for having me on this series. It's been a pleasure to have the chance to chat to you, and I'm grateful for the chance to speak. And hopefully, as you say, we'll have a much better All Black team by next year in Paris.
Right, very good. So I think the last thing maybe is sort of to alert you to our next Franco-German Observatory of the Indo-Pacific, which will take place, I believe, on the 30th of September. It will be all about sort of European perspectives on connectivity issues in the Indo-Pacific. Our speakers will be Ambassador Romana Flautin, who's Special Envoy for Connectivity with the EU, and Maike Okano-Heymans, who is with the Klingendahl Institute in The Hague. So looking forward to that webinar, and thanking you for sort of being with us today. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks to the audience.
Bye-bye.